the early part of 1941, the Philippine Islands were thought to be one of the safest places in the world to be. Few people ever thought that the war would ever reach the islands. In December 1941, war clouds hung heavily over the islands. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese military order was sent out for all American and Allied civilians to surrender to the Japanese authorities. Over 6,000 American and Allied civilians were captured and taken to civilian prisoner of war camps, where they spent the next 37 months. They were crowded into Santo Tomas and Los Baños University campuses. These camps became organized cities of internees. Life continued as best as could be done under the severe and crowded conditions. Food was in short supply from the beginning and was a main concern for everyone. The Japanese military provided very little for their captives. If it had not been for the loyalness and generosity of the Filipino people, bringing food and supplies to the internees, many would have starved. On February 3, 1945, an American plane flew over Santo Tomas camp, dropping a pilot's goggle case with a note that read, "Roll out the barrel, there's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight." After crashing through the main gates of Santo Tomas, the two American tanks, the Georgia Peach and the Battling Basics, made their way to the main building with combat soldiers following behind them. The camp was shelled for several days by the Japanese soldiers on the outside of the camp. Many internees lost their lives after the liberation due to the shelling. On February 23, 1945, the 11th Airborne Paratroopers made a daring rescue of the civilian prisoners from the internment camp at Los Baños, freeing over 800 internees from death by starvation. The following are some of their stories.
My name is Earl Henry Hornbostle, pre-war resident of Manila. My father came to the Philippines back in 1905, and in the military service. I was born in Guam, came here in 1928, went to Central School, and like most Americans here, was caught in the city at the outbreak of the war. Just before the war, I had worked for 3 years for the HE company in radio technical capacity, and just a week before the war started working for Pan American Airways in their local communications station. But this didn't last very long, because the war broke out. Our station, which was located in Makati, where the Manila Polo Club stands today, was bombed the first night of the war. We, those working with Pan American, immediately went to work for the Signal Corps. Naturally, I was one of those. Again, this job didn't last very long, because the troops pulled out, went over to Bataan and Corregidor. So since my father had rejoined the military when the war broke out, he was assigned with the engineers in Bataan due to his early experience, where back 1905, 1906, he was with the Coast Artillery Corps, which was charged with the task of mapping this country. He knew Bataan very well, just like MacArthur, because they were together in those early days in Bataan. The confusion when the Japanese came into Manila for the American and other Allied nationals was difficult to describe because we were widely separated around the city. We didn't know really what was happening. And being out here in San Juan, where the main American and other foreign population was in Pasay, Ermita, Malati, we were the last picked up. Actually, what happened to me was somewhat different. I was picked up separately from my mother and sister ahead and brought to the headquarters of the Hodobu, which was the Japanese propaganda corps charged with administering newspapers and to get radio broadcasting going again. Due to my extensive knowledge of the technical side of radio broadcasting, I was pulled in by them and was first kept in the Bayside Hotel, and then for a while in the Manila Polo Club, Manila Yacht Club, where they first intended to set up their broadcasting. I wasn't brought into Santo Tomas until February 22nd, George Washington's birthday. There were later in the course of that year, other American technical people from RCA Communications, Globe Wireless, Mackay Radio were brought out for short times and made to help get their communication centers operating. The fortunate thing that happened to me in connection with the Hodobu was that the Japanese lieutenant, his name was Kano, spoke very good English, had gone to school in England where his father was a Japanese bank manager, and because I had been a radio amateur or ham, I had communicated with Japanese amateurs before the war, and one in particular who up to this day is still alive and very active, who happened to be a friend of this Lieutenant Kano. Lieutenant Kano was quite young, and he had a great respect for this Japanese ham, whose name was Hari Uneda, and who had gotten him into the technical side of radio. So when he found out that I was acquainted with him, he was very helpful to me when I was returned to Santo Tomas to allow me to bring in audio equipment that I had at home, our record collection, and to allow me to communicate with some Filipino friends who could help me with more equipment, loudspeakers, microphones, etc. So after being put into Santo Tomas in room 60, we, on the ground floor of the main building, I started to set up a complete wired broadcasting system for the camp. We had loudspeakers set up in all the different buildings. We built a little studio on the ground floor. The Masons were able to get in their Hammond organ. Others were able to get in records. My contact with Filipino friends outside allowed me to get wires, microphones, loudspeakers, amplifiers, and all the things we needed. This way, we were able to have regular evening broadcasts, everyone gathered in front of the main building in their folding chairs. We played musical concerts from time to time. We had live broadcasts, so to speak. For example, Grace Nash playing her violin, another man who was really a concert pianist, others who were expert with the organ, because we had some church people who were proficient with the Hammond organ, so that we were able to provide the necessary physical setup to tie the camp together. Those who were in the gym, for example, or the education building, or other isolated buildings, could also hear these musical broadcasts. And the record playing was done, of course, on a daily basis. It was interesting that the biggest source of controversy insofar as our operations were concerned was the jazz versus classical warfare. Of course, the young people wanted jazz. The older people wanted to hear more of the classical and semi-classical music. So this was a fight that never ended. The thing of our entertainment setup was greatly increased when Dave Harvey and others organized and got the materials to build a stage in front of the main building. The various things that were needed were somehow improvised or provided. For example, for stage lighting, the footlights were made out of the large 2 or 3 pound milk cans. The inside tin plating with, say, a 100-watt bulb made a pretty good light source. We had a string of them across the front of the stage. The stage itself was made out of lumber, bamboo, nipa thatch, and sawali. And we even had a loft on it. This, since we had all kinds of people in the camp, including even one Australian troupe who were roller skater, vaudeville type show, were there, and skilled performers and choreographers like Dave Harvey. We were able to put on pretty good shows. My own reason, even before being brought into Santo Tomas, my own reason for wanting to put up this sound system was the fact that in 1938, I had put up a similar system in the psychopathic hospital here, the government. And this was done by initiated by a young Filipino doctor who had recently returned from the United States. And he learned the very basic principle that in his U.S. training, that there's nothing like music to soothe the savage breast. And this made me think that if I wanted to be able to be of service to the camp, it would be best if I would use my skills, my connections with local people, and whatever I had to get a system like that installed in Santo Tomas. In a place, in an internment camp with several thousand people crowded together with an uncertain future and unknown circumstances external to the camp, rumors were not only rife, but they were disturbing in the sense that extremely optimistic rumors would only lead to disappointment. And if you have people listening to music, they don't have time after the daily work that they had to do, get together in the evening. They weren't gossiping, they were enjoying music. So this thing worked, and it worked well. The interesting thing was that everyone in the camp was, as you have heard before, assigned to camp duty. So this was my assignment. And there were others helping me. One was Jack Chapman. Another was a little English radio operator. His name was Jimmy Flowers, who had the unfortunate experience of having been in a ship sunken either by submarines or aircraft 3 times, the last being in Manila Bay, a British ship that was sunk in the early bombings here. Anyway, with fellows like that, with some degree of skill and so on, we did very well. The number of people involved in this endeavor at one time or another was probably about 6. You know, in Santo Tomas, everything was arranged or organized on a committee basis. So after I proposed to the camp authorities that we put up this sound system, the first thing they did was to appoint what they called a music committee. These were elderly people who happened to be American. There were about 4 of them. Everything would be done in their name, but people like me were the ones who got things done, got the materials, did the work, and so on. So, and we were young fellows, so naturally we didn't get much credit as and had no real authority. But when there was something to be done, we did it and found the solutions. Keeping the equipment going was a difficult thing. We had, my own experience helped greatly in this because of several years' involvement in initially servicing radio equipment and then manufacturing and selling it later. So, including that of building broadcast equipment such as the audio and transmitters. So, the most important thing was that we were able to provide the vehicle to hold the camp together and provide the necessary daily communications for work assignments, for food line instructions, whatever came along. The camp ruling group could get the word across to the people fast. We had on our program origination side, of course, we did have skilled people. For example, Don Bell, whose name was Belial, actually, who was well known in Manila before the war as the news announcer for KZRH. He is most famous for our daily news broadcast in the camp, and was much quoted when Leyte was invaded by making the statement, "Better late than never." At that time, unfortunately, I wasn't in the camp. I had been taken out on leap year day, 1944, for being involved in disseminating shortwave news transcripts. The funny thing about it was that I was not guilty of that, for the simple reason that we did have a radio, and I didn't have to disseminate transcripts that came from outside, but the transcripts that I was being charged with disseminating did come from the outside, but it wasn't I that was involved in distributing them. The story of how I got out of that would take too long to recite now, but it was the fact that I came out alive was due to unbelievable circumstances. If someone made it into a book or movie script, it would not seem plausible. Anyway, the most important thing was that after 6 months of internment in Santo Tomas, a number of people who were staff of the U.S. High Commissioner's office and had a semi-diplomatic status were able to, or rather were brought into Santo Tomas, and they brought with them a disassembled ham transmitter, a piece of equipment I was very familiar with. And this was given to me, and I had this hidden in various parts of the building, aside from using some of the material in our studio. This was hidden away by various friends with the intention of putting it together at the appropriate time when American forces were near in order to receive instructions. When people were repatriated in 1943, one of them carried the word back to the U.S. for me that we were prepared to do this. And we had even arranged for a broadcast on Christmas Day of 1943, which involved sending a Disney tune at a certain time from the KGEI station in San Francisco, which we received in Santo Tomas. And but this signal never came because it was turned down. It was thought by the powers that be in the military intelligence in the United States that I was too young and irresponsible to be involved with such a thing. Unfortunately, the man who carried the message back to the States wasn't familiar with my age, and I looked much too young for my age. At the time that this occurred, I was 27 or 28. and I looked about 18. We had a great variety of people in Santo Tomas, and the means of survival was varied, and the motives and the planning of everyone was different. You could say that there were three types of people insofar as ability to survive were concerned. First were the well-established Manila businessmen and British, Dutch, etc., who had banking, commercial, or institutional connections, who could be sure that they would receive funds after the war, and therefore with those connections and their Filipino friends were in a position to borrow money. There was a second group which would include those who might or could have the ability to borrow money but didn't want to go into debt because of uncertainty as to their ability to repay immediately after the war. And then there was the third group who were without means, without the knowledge to earn money in the camp, and or the improvident, ignorant, or in other ways not capable of surviving. Now, what did it take to survive? The food ration given by the Japanese was not only insufficient, especially in the last year and a half, but were still greatly unbalanced. It was necessary, if you were to survive in reasonable health, to get those ingredients that were lacking: fruit, vegetables, and protein sources. One could not survive alone on just rice. The first year in Santo Tomas was pretty good. One reason was that there was a shipload of cracked rice donated by the American Red Cross to the people of China that was stranded in Manila Bay. And the Japanese fortunately allowed the Red Cross here to get this for the camp. So this cracked wheat was quite nutritious, although it didn't take long for it to get filled with weevils and their grubs. One of the sights of the camp was the daily long benches filled with women picking out these insect infestations. Anyway, going back to the matter of surviving, since the Japanese did allow for a period, for the first 2 years, that food could be sent in from the outside, those who had the means could borrow money and get in what they needed, some even to the extent of having their laundry done outside. Others, like myself, not wanting to go into debt, found a way to make a living in the camp. In my case, I learned how to make candy, and I worked on this during the hours every day that I wasn't busy on my camp duties. Fortunately, these mostly involved working in the evening, so I had the daytime usually free of camp duty and could make the candy, which two of my friends, who also needed to earn money, sold. There were all kinds of people involved in these small industries. A man in my room, for example, was a ship's carpenter on one of the President line boats that was sunk in Manila Bay, and he was actually a communist. But being a carpenter, he went to work with a couple of friends and built shanties for the internees that could get in the materials for them. And I will say that after about 4 months of this kind of private enterprise, he, like the Russians today, rapidly lost all his communist inclinations, and he no longer tried to convert the rest of us. He's stuck to his business because he found this made sense. The others, there was one Jewish chemist from Vienna who found a way to make lipstick. He was able to get the materials in, and he made lipstick for the ladies. He was successful in this. There was another fellow from Chicago that I remember. His pre-war profession in Manila had been, he was a gambler, a professional one. Became the used condom dealer in Santo Tomas. And of course, the women had all kinds of little businesses going. They would sew for others. They would dress other women's hair. There were people who were able to accumulate enough books or had collections in their home which they were able to bring in and have a rental library. You could say, you name it, you'd find it there. One type of business or another. So these people survived, were able to earn enough money out of their activities to pay for the extra food that they needed. So we were all kept pretty busy. The only people that did not make use of their professions to earn money was the doctors and the nurses. More credit to them. But then they had a lot of grateful patients. So the grateful patients, I can assure you, took care of them in their requirements. We had a small hospital outside the walls, but across the street from the main compound, but a temporary wall had been built across that street so that the hospital compound was really part of Santo Tomas. Among the nurses we had was a number of Navy nurses and above all Army nurses, some of whom had been in Corregidor and Bataan. In the camp, one of the most well-known persons was Dave Harvey. Dave Harvey was a tall, thin man who had a very engaging grin, was always even-tempered, and very resourceful in getting the best out of any performer for our shows. He had come to Manila in 1940 with a vaudeville troupe, and he was the head choreographer. Unfortunately, this troupe broke up here as it went broke. The rest returned to the United States. Dave decided to stay here and therefore was caught at the outbreak of the war. I worked closely together with him because of the sound systems that we had set up. In the latter part of in the middle of 1942, we set up a stage in the main plaza in front of the main building. This stage was constructed out of bamboo, lumber, nipa, and sawali. It was not what you would call modern looking, but it had a loft, it had stage lights, footlights that is, made out of old lactogen milk cans with 100-watt bulbs inside. And together with the sound system and temporary loudspeakers for each stage show, could ensure that 4,000 or 5,000 people could enjoy the show. When we did put on a show, I can assure you that nearly everyone was there, except for small children. Dave spent long hours rehearsing his troupe. There was a lot of talent in the camp, so whether it was a dramatic show or a musical one, they could always find the right persons to handle the role. With Dave's coaching and with the other skilled people in the camp, our shows were really quite good, in spite of the insufficiency of proper props and equipment. Dave was well loved not only because of his activities, but because he was a warm human person. His real name was David McTurk, but he had long before Santo Tomas assumed the stage name of Dave Harvey and was known for the rest of his life by that name. Dave was able to receive permission at a later date to live in the loft of the stage together with his girlfriend Phyllis, whom he later married. Phyllis was half Indian and half English, and by Indian, of course, I mean the British Indians. We were able, in late 1942, to get permission from the Japanese to have movie shows on that plaza using a screen set up on the stage. This was projected from a little shack that we built in the middle of the plaza with wires running out to the stage for the loudspeakers we set up there. While we were able to get in equipment from a businessman in the camp, whose company here, I believe, was S.M. Berger and Company, in the theatrical supply business. So we were able to project standard 35 millimeter film. We were able to bring in a few shorts. One of them was an Andrews Sisters short, which included, among other songs, the Beer Barrel Polka, and 2 or 3 Disney shorts. However, the promised films that the Japanese were going to allow us to bring in never came through. Instead, we were given a total of 2 Japanese films, which were in English. They were more or less propaganda films, one in the form of a story, and I still remember the name, Morning Over China, which glorified the Japanese activities in China. However, this movie setup was a very important one to us for another reason. The man who actually operated the movie projector was Bob Marion. Bob was, like myself, a radio engineer, and was assigned the job of operating this movie equipment, which had its own amplifier. I would want to remind you of the geography of that front plaza. Facing north towards this large main building, you could see at the right-hand side a small one-story building which before the war had been the Santo Tomas co-op store. The Japanese had preempted this building and used it as their office for running the camp. In addition, they also had a guard house which housed about 15 or so soldiers at the main gate. And these soldiers, aside from patrolling the inside perimeter of the camp at night, in the daytime were only seen around the gate. The problem, or rather our solution to the problem of having a radio receiver operating in the camp was a serious one. In the first place, in that large reinforced concrete building, radio reception was very poor if an inside antenna was used, and extremely noisy from the fluorescent lamps. Therefore, an outside antenna was necessary if one were to receive KGEI. So Bob and myself put our heads together to see what we could do as a solution. So we had a brilliant idea, and that was to use the Edgar Allan Poe gold bug solution, which, if any of you remember that story, involved hiding an object from people searching for a piece of incriminating evidence in a house, and putting it in such a way that it would not be easily discovered. And the way that Edgar Allan Poe solved it was to put it in the most obvious place, right in the front living room close to the entrance door. The object of the story was, or rather, not the object, but the result was that it wasn't found. So what we did was to hide that radio receiver, build it into that movie projector, right there in the middle of the plaza, in full sight of the commandant's office. Now, to use that receiver, it was obvious that you had to listen with the headphones, because there was no other way to do it without being caught for no other reason, by passerbys who might hear the loudspeaker of a radio. And that was important, because the other reason why we could not easily operate a radio receiver inside the building was that it was bound to be noticed by other people sooner or later, and we were deadly afraid of being reported, because the camp was always rife with rumors about spies among us. In any event, we did keep possession of these short films that I mentioned earlier, and they were played repeatedly. Bob's and my excuse for running the films 3 or 4 times a week was simply that we had to keep the equipment warmed up to prevent deterioration. In those days, that was a very true fact. Electronic components, transformers and capacitors particularly, deteriorated quickly in a tropical environment, unlike today, where we have electronic components that are not in any way affected by fungus or moisture. It was a big headache in those days. So we had a valid reason for running those films. And so Bob was in the little shack, crouched down in a corner, running the projector with the film and listening with the headphones to the radio, which could receive KGEI. It was a very simple thing to provide a good antenna, because here we were out in the open, in a wide open spaces where any wire up in the air would make a good antenna. And since we had wires running all over the place for our loudspeakers going to the stage, and since our main front plaza loudspeakers were also nearby with wires running to them, there was no way for anyone to know that one of these wires was really an antenna. Actually, it ran over to the stage. And this went on for several months, in fact, more than a year. Eventually, we had to shut it down because the Japanese wanted the projector, and we had no longer any excuse for being in that hut. Of course, before we returned the projector, the radio was removed. Then it was hid in the loft of the stage. And Dave, who had by that time obtained permission to sleep there, keeping in mind that his girlfriend was not allowed, as we all from Santo Tomas would know, the Japanese did not allow any kind of cohabitation in shanties, or certainly not in the main building. Therefore, Dave would climb up into the top of the loft every evening and receive KGEI. and was an important, therefore was an important source of news for the camp. But of course this was not the only radio in the camp. There was another one hidden up on the top floor of the building in the chemistry laboratories where the camp soap was being made. I only found out about this one accidentally. In fact, it was one of the Pan American engineers that had rigged it up. And I early suspected that somebody had a radio because a radio tube from one of my amplifiers disappeared. So I could only figure that someone needed it very badly. It was only much later that I discovered the real reason why the tube disappeared. Yes, it was needed in that radio. Anyway, so Dave, like many of us, risked his life to help keep up camp morale, not only because of his stage activities, but because of the operating of the radio. People like myself and Bob Merriam were very much afraid of operating a radio because we figured that if there was a spy, if there were, which I doubt to this day there were, in the camp, people that were involved in the technical side of radio would be the first to be suspected and watched. Incidentally, if we talk about spies, the biggest suspect in the camp was a man by the name of Stanley, who was British, and everyone suspected he was a spy because he was tapped by the Japanese to be the interpreter in the camp office and had to relay all the instructions, messages, and rules from the Japanese to the camp administration, our internal administration. And this poor fellow, everyone was afraid to talk to him. It turned out after the war that he was a Scotland Yard agent, a British intelligence, had been stationed in Tokyo and got out just before the war started and was unfortunately stranded in Manila on his way to India. I'd like to tell you now a little bit about my experiences in the last year of the war. I was unfortunately involved mistakenly in the distribution of radio news transcripts. As I said earlier, I didn't need them, but a close friend of mine had his father in the camp. This man, Johnny Harris, was not in the camp. He was an American mestizo. His father, however, was in the camp. His mother was Filipino, and these people were generally not interned. He had a radio receiver concealed in a closet in his house and daily made transcripts of the KGEI broadcasts and passed them around to his friends. 3 times a week he met the drug buyers, or that is more properly medicine buyers, from Santo Tomas. These men, Stu Barnett, and two others who in peacetime were actually representatives of large American drug houses in Manila. They were allowed to go out 3 times a week to purchase medicines and medical supplies, and would meet Johnny and exchange fountain pens. Well, for the young people today, we don't realize it, but a fountain pen in those days was rather large diameter and had a rubber, flexible rubber capsule inside, which you could easily remove. And it would take considerable amount of onion skin paper. So Johnny would type up his transcripts on onion skin, put it in a fountain pen, and meet the drug dealers and exchange fountain pens, which they brought into camp, read themselves, and gave to Johnny's father, who was a friend of mine. Anyway, his father was, Johnny was caught, his father was involved, and the 3 drug dealers were brought out of the camp. When Johnny's father was tortured, he brought my name into the picture, so I was taken out and interrogated due to the most fortunate circumstances of being interrogated in a dungeon of Fort Santiago next to another dungeon where the old man's previous testimony was being reviewed by an interpreter. I was able to overhear while being interrogated myself with and acquired therefore the knowledge of exactly what they had against me, which was simply supposed to be passing around transcripts. The crux of the story was that in the previous year, I had been repairing radios belonging to the Japanese staff and guards, repairing them in the camp, turned over to me by the camp electricians. Mr. Harris, the senior, had given him rather close descriptions of the transcripts which I had supposedly shown him, and into such details as the color of the onion skin paper and the dates that I had shown these to him. This was a complete fabrication. I never had shown any transcripts to the old man. It was the other way around. But the important thing was that I knew the dates and the descriptions of the paper that was supposed to have been used. Having a lot of time sitting in the cell before my specific interrogation began, I could think back, and the incredible thing, an unbelievable thing, was that the dates given by the old man fell within a period in every case, and there were several different periods involved, within the time that I was repairing a radio for the Japanese. Fortunately, the old man did not say they were KGEI transcripts, only that they were radio broadcast transcripts. At that time, it was a death penalty for listening to shortwave radio. But the other fortunate thing for me was that there was a 50 kilowatt broadcast band station in Chongqing in Free China, and this station could be received in Manila on some days when propagation was good, so that I was able to tell the Japanese interrogator that that is what I had received, and that it was done while I was repairing these radios. They went to the camp and took out for a couple of days the camp electricians with whom I had fixed the radios for, and since everything jibed, they didn't really have much on me.